everyone for joining us this morning on Thursday, April 20th. We're excited to have you here on our HealthLinks webinar. This is our second webinar of 2023, and we're going to be speaking about cannabis in the workplace, what both employers and employees need to know. A little bit about us. My name is David Shapiro, and I am the Senior Manager of Programs and Partnerships at the Center for Health, Work, and Environment at the Colorado School of Public Health. I am a white male joining you from our office in Aurora, Colorado. I use he, him pronouns. Today, I have brown curly hair and a brown beard. I'm wearing a light blue button-down shirt and dark gray glasses. My Zoom screen has a background with the HealthLinks logo interchanged in black and white. Our center is one of 10 centers of excellence funded by the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, to speak about total worker health, the integration of workplace health and safety, and how organizations really carry that out in practice. And so today we're going to be talking about impairment and how impairment through and by cannabis affects your workers and affects the health and safety of your workers. Obviously, there's been a lot of discussion about cannabis, not only today, but over the past decade or so, and we're pleased to be joined by some subject matter experts from Colorado. Few housekeeping items. All of you as participants are on mute throughout the durations of the webinar. And this is a good time to use the chat function. We want you to log in using the chat on your Zoom toolbar and tell us where you're coming from. Where are you joining us from this morning? We've had the privilege of honoring individuals from all 50 states and from 15 countries over the past year or so. So if you can type in the chat where you're joining us from at whatever the time of day it is where you're located, we'd appreciate it. So use the chat for technical questions and technical assistance. And then if you have specific questions for myself or for any of the panelists, we're going to encourage you to put those in the Q&A section of the Zoom toolbar. That way you can vote on them. You don't have to retype someone else's question. If you were thinking of the same thing, you can use the thumbs up feature to move them up the list. And we will have time at the conclusion of the webinar to ask our panelists and our speakers these questions. For all of you that want continuing education credits, we know how important that is, especially to you CHES individuals looking for CHES credits. There will be a survey that automatically pops up at the end of the webinar. Please make sure to fill that out. One, we really appreciate your feedback, and two, that's the metric we use for issuing those credits. This webinar is being recorded, and you'll receive the link to the recording at some point in the next 48 hours. And finally, if you need closed captioning, that's available through Zoom and your toolbar as well. We always start with a land acknowledgement from the University of Colorado, and I will read that. As we gather in this virtual space, we honor and acknowledge that the University of Colorado, 4 campuses are on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, Apache, Comanche, Kiowa, Lakota, Pueblo, and Shoshone nations. Further, we acknowledge the 48 contemporary tribal nations historically tied to the lands that comprise what is now called Colorado. Acknowledging that we live in the homelands of indigenous peoples recognizes the original stewards of these lands and their legacies. With this land acknowledgement, we celebrate the many contributions of Native peoples to the fields of medicine, mathematics, government and military service, arts, literature, engineering, and more. We also recognize the sophisticated and intricate knowledge systems indigenous peoples have developed in relationship to their lands. We recognize and affirm that the ties these nations have to their traditional homelands and the many indigenous people who thrive in this place alive and strong. We also acknowledge the painful history of ill treatment and forced removal that has had a profoundly negative impact on Native nations. We respect the many diverse indigenous peoples still connected to this land. We honor them and thank the indigenous ancestors of this place. The University of Colorado pledges to provide educational opportunities for Native students, faculty, and staff and advance our mission to understand the history and contemporary lives of all Native peoples. So today's webinar, we have a keynote presentation as well as a panel to provide some context to the information from our keynote speaker, and then we will have time for question and answer with all of our speakers. And our learning objectives are for you to understand a little bit more about how cannabis is impacting impairment for workers and how that's related to workplace health and safety, as well as what are current considerations for impairment testing or workplace cannabis drug testing and drug screening at your workplace. I'm honored to introduce our keynote presenter, Dr. Mike Van Dyke. Dr. Van Dyke is an industrial hygienist, researcher, public health practitioner, and educator. He's an associate professor in the Department of Environmental and Occupational Health and the Center for Health, Work, and Environment at our Colorado School of Public Health, with over 20 years of experience that has been spent in academic, community, clinical, and government levels in his professional practice, research, education, and policy. Dr. Van Dyke is a certified industrial hygienist and is recognized for his contributions related to exposure assessment, occupational beryllium exposure, first responder exposures in clandestine methamphetamine laboratories, indoor air quality, public health aspects of legalized cannabis, and community exposures related to oil and gas extraction. Dr. Van Dyke is passionate about evidence-based decision-making and risk communication. So thank you, Mike, for joining us today. I'm going to stop sharing so you can pull up your presentation.
Well, thank you all for having me. It is always humbling to be on one of these webinars as you see how many people are in the audience in the background here. So thank you all for joining. So I'm going to, all right, I think everybody could see that now. So thank you, David. Again, my name is Mike Van Dyke. As you heard from my bio, I am a longtime occupational health professional that, for reasons that are still somewhat unclear to me, became the director of Colorado's public health experts around recreational marijuana when it was legalized in 2013. So, both of these things are near and dear to my heart. So with that, whenever I do a cannabis talk, I have to have some disclosures just because I want you all to know who you're talking to today. So first and foremost, I have never received any funding from the cannabis industry. I am a former employee of the government, in particular, Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. I did vote to legalize medical and recreational cannabis. I am not a cannabis user, and I really consider myself cannabis agnostic. I like to look at the evidence and see what it says. So with that, I think the reason we're here talking about this on 420 is because this country has a long history of drug testing. And just to put that in context, in 1981, military testing began after an accident on the USS Nimitz. This was really followed in 1986 by an executive order from President Reagan that required testing of federal employees, and closely by two other acts, the Drug-Free Workplace Act, as well as the 1991 Omnibus Employee Testing Act, which you all know as requiring testing for transportation employees. Now, this all fell in kind of the context of the 80s, which started out with Nancy Reagan's Just Say No to Drugs campaign. And in the middle of the decade, we really had this tragic death of Lynn Bias due to a drug overdose, and a tragic accident in Maryland that was related to marijuana use. So the 80s were the era when this all started. And just to kind of give you some context, in 1982, only about 10% of large private companies did any sort of drug testing. By 1998, we were up to almost half of companies that were doing some kind of drug testing. So this is a reason we're still talking about this today. And I want to make sure that you also understand that, cannabis use is not necessarily a new thing. This has been around for a long time. And I really love to put up this graph because you have a lot of people out there who say we've legalized cannabis and the sky is falling. But if you look at the prevalence of current marijuana use in 1978 versus the current marijuana use in 2016, we are actually at a lower level than we were in 1978. So keeping in mind that this is not a new thing. The reason that things have changed is because lots of states have legalized marijuana in some form or another, whether it's recreational or medical marijuana or even CBD. This is the reason we're talking about that. Another reason is that things have changed in terms of the spectrums of products that are available. We now have cannabis products in all kinds of flavors and types, from inhalable products in terms of concentrates, things like vape oils, as well as oral products and the traditional flower that has been smoked for years and years. So the spectrum of products is a lot different. So this presents different problems for cannabis use in the workplace. The other thing that has changed is cannabis potency. So if you look at the data on the amount of THC that's in cannabis, you can see that that has steadily increased since the 90s. And at this point, in 1995, the average potency was somewhere around 4%. At this point, the average potency in terms of THC is somewhere around 18% in states like Colorado. So things are definitely different than they used to be, and that's a good reason to be talking about these things. So in order to start the conversation, I definitely want to put everybody on the same page about how many people really use cannabis. And for these conversations, I'm really going to focus on Colorado data because Colorado has pretty good data on these things. And what we could see is, as of right now, about 19% of people in Colorado have used cannabis in the past 30 days or the past month. It's somewhat lower at the national level, around 12%. When we look closer at these people who are using cannabis, we really want to think about, there's different kinds of use of cannabis. And thinking about those people, what we could see is that about 20% of those folks are monthly or occasional users, but about half of the people who used cannabis in the last month are daily or near daily cannabis users. So what this translates to is about 10% of the Colorado population uses cannabis on a daily or near daily basis, which is important for thinking about the workplace. The next thing to think about is, how are these people using cannabis? And this is a graph that really shows the method of use for cannabis in Colorado. And what you'll first see is that these don't add up to 100%. So many people in Colorado are using cannabis in multiple ways. What we've seen since legalization, we've seen that the predominant method of use is the traditional smoking of cannabis flower. However, since cannabis legalization, we've seen almost a 10% increase in the people who are using edible products. Now, in the old days in a workplace, you can go out to the parking lot and smell people using cannabis. These days, with all these different methods of use, that is really not possible to do. And then in thinking about employees, we need to understand that cannabis use is not distributed equally among different age groups. I think this is fairly intuitive for most, but pointing it out that really, about 30% of people less than the age of 35 use cannabis. It goes way down if we start thinking about people who are over 35. Being over 35 myself, I think it's really that we're all just too tired already to use cannabis. And then finally, we always need to put this in perspective. Cannabis is just one of many substances that people use. So making sure we put this in perspective to think about substance use, what we could see is that, as I said, in Colorado, about 10% of people use cannabis on a daily or near daily basis. This is less than the percentage of people that use cigarettes, and about half of the percentage of people who binge drink alcohol. So cannabis is one of these substances, but I don't want to miss these other substances as we think about this. Focusing more on the workplace, what we know about cannabis use in the workplace is cannabis use is not distributed equally throughout different industries. If we look at some of these industries where mandatory drug testing from a federal level is still required, things like healthcare and transportation, the relative prevalence of marijuana use is much lower than in industries like accommodation and food services or arts and entertainment. Now, some of this is related to the age of the workers in these industries. You kind of expect younger workers in accommodation and food services, and you definitely see that when you age adjust those rates. But keeping in mind that, first of all, the rates are different, but there's a substantial proportion of people that use cannabis in nearly every industry. So we talked about things changing. We talked about how cannabis was legalized. I want to make sure that we talk about what hasn't changed. So for the most part, and in most states, cannabis legalization does not affect the ability of an employer to prohibit cannabis use in the workplace. Employers still have that right. Cannabis legalization doesn't preclude federal drug testing rules and doesn't preclude drug testing for safety-sensitive positions. It also has no effect on drug testing for cause or post-accident. Okay, so none of these things have changed as a result of legalization. Now, from a federal level, the use of medical marijuana is not a federally recognized condition as requiring accommodations. Some states have made changes to this, and more changes are likely in the works. And then in many states, cannabis use can still affect workers' compensation payments. For example, in Colorado, you get about a 50% reduction in your workers' compensation payments if you test positive for cannabis after an accident. Now, a few states do have current requirements for accommodation of medical use. Definitely check your state laws. And most importantly, this is a tough issue, so please talk to a lawyer. And luckily today we have a lawyer on our panel who can answer all your legal questions, I'm sure. So as we talk about cannabis use in the workplace, I want to call your attention to a really comprehensive guidance that was developed by the American College of Occupational and Environmental Medicine. And this is some guidance that was developed in 2015. Much of it is really still relevant for how we should handle cannabis in the workplace now. This was a thoughtful effort, and it was done by people, including physicians from Colorado, who were thinking about legalization at that time. So it might not be as outdated as it sounds. So when we talk about cannabis in the workplace, we talk about drug testing. I want to make sure we're all on the same page. Typically when we talk about pre-employment drug testing, we talk about urine testing. And there's specific requirements for the Department of Transportation. But mostly I want to talk about pre-employment urine testing in that it does not measure impairment or recent use. THC is different than other drugs in that THC can remain detectable in urine for a long period of time, up to 3 days after a single use. And if somebody is a long-term heavy smoker, it can remain detectable in urine for more than 30 days, and even longer if somebody uses high potency concentrates. So this is not a good measurement to measure impairment. It's not a good measurement to measure recent use. Now, it is true, if you look at urine test results for cannabis over time, these are pre-employment drug screens. What we could see is if we look at federally mandated safety-sensitive workforces, we see a slight increase over time in the percentage of positive tests. And it doesn't seem to matter a whole lot whether you're in a recreational state or in a neither recreational or medical use state. Those percent positives are higher among people who are not federally mandated in safety-sensitive positions, up to a point that about 5% of people who do a drug screen in a state with recreational marijuana use will test positive in a pre-employment screen. So it is definitely a fact that positive tests are increasing. But because these tests don't measure impairment or recent use, we want to think about impairment in general and what does impairment look like? I think all of us on this call today can agree that cannabis can cause impairment. This impairment looks like things like an altered sense of time and space, impaired coordination, decreased memory or attention, decreased reaction time, which can be measurable, decreased cognitive function, and impaired decision-making. I think we can all agree that cannabis can cause these things, and many people use cannabis to get these things. But I think the hard questions are really how much impairment does it take to affect a given task? This is a hard question for any substance. Are there outward recognizable signs and symptoms at this level of impairment? Does this level of impairment increase occupational injuries? And can we measure this level of impairment with a blood test rather than a urine test? So to start with one of these questions, does cannabis use affect the risk of occupational injury? And I wish I had a really good answer for you, but I don't. The most recent systematic review of the literature of cannabis use and risk of occupational injury really shows that there are really mixed results. Among the 16 studies they looked at, 7 of those studies showed a positive association between cannabis use and occupational injury risk. and 8 of them showed no association between cannabis use and occupational injury. Now, it shows that this is a really challenging thing to study. It's a really challenging thing to measure, and there's many confounders to this. So I think we can agree that cannabis causes impairment. Whether that translates to increased occupational injuries, I don't think we really know the answer to that. So the American College of Occupational and Environmental Medicine have really taken the approach of that THC serum level or blood level of 5 nanograms per milliliter is roughly equivalent to the level of impairment produced by a blood alcohol level of 0.05. Now, a 0.05 blood alcohol level is considered a mild impairment. Many states, the level for driving impairment is 0.08. They've also concluded that THC urine screens are not useful to assess impairment, as we talked about earlier. So the approach that they've taken is that this serum level of 5 nanograms per milliliter, plus observable signs and symptoms of impairment, is equal to occupational or workplace impairment. Now, on the other side of things, there's a specific occupational task that lots of people do, driving. And I think we could talk about impairment in a lot more comprehensive way there. I think we can agree that there is substantial evidence in the literature that cannabis can cause driving impairment and increase the risk of a crash. Now, we can argue somewhat about what level of impairment there is or the blood level that causes that, but cannabis can cause these things. So there is a risk to using cannabis and driving. And states have taken different approaches to driving impairment as well. Some states have a zero tolerance approach, meaning if you get pulled over, it's detectable in blood, they can call you impaired. Some states require a THC to be detectable in blood and have an observable impairment. And then some states like Colorado have what are called per se laws, where 5 nanograms per milliliter of THC in whole blood equals impairment. Now, what the scientific literature tells us about this is that some of these per se limits probably don't work very well. And this is really because there's a pretty poor and inconsistent relationship between the level of impairment and THC concentrations in things like blood. And what this really means is that these limits don't do a good job to discriminate between those people who are impaired or unimpaired. And it gets even more complicated when we start talking about people who have tolerance from frequent use of marijuana, as well as people who are using things like edibles, which have different toxicology in the blood and how they get to the brain. So where are we going? I think the place that we're going and the thing that all safety folks are talking about is really thinking about a holistic impairment program. Really doing things like recognizing that impairment is additive and impairment is caused by things like fatigue, alcohol, cannabis, stress, mental stress, and really acknowledging that this cannot be measured reliably with a blood or urine test. So these holistic impairment programs really focus on 2 things. First of all, they focus on training, making sure supervisors and workers are trained to recognize impairments and making sure that they're trained to intervene when somebody is impaired in a legal and tactful way. And then the second thing is really to establish workplace programs that address the causes of impairment. And luckily, you are all on a Health Links webinar today. And I will say that really Health Links is really at the forefront of really thinking about this total worker health approach to address these things in a holistic way, which is the topic of many other webinars that you can access on this site. In terms of the future, I think the future is, can we really measure overall impairment? Now, there's some data that shows that we can measure impairment through a short phone-based app. And these data look pretty good, that we can actually measure the impairment from things like cannabis. I think some of the issues that are still out there is what level of impairment constitutes an occupational risk. So I think there's a lot of work to be done still, but I think it's promising work that can be done. So with that, I want to end in summary. We talked about the prevalence of cannabis use in the workplace. I think we can all agree that there's substantial evidence that cannabis can cause impairment, both in performance and driving. I want to make sure you all understand that urine testing does not measure recent use or impairment, and that, the data are pretty mixed on the correlation between blood levels and impairment as well. Referring you again to the American College of Occupational and Environmental Medicine guidelines as a great place to start. And then really thinking in the future about holistic impairment programs. National Safety Council is a great place to refer to that as well, and evaluating the use of these app-based tools. So with that, I can turn it back over to David.
Thanks so much, Mike. As a reminder to everybody participating today, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A section of your Zoom toolbar. I see that Andrew Friedman is already responding to some of the questions that come up. Thank you, Andrew. But we will also get to everybody's questions. Hopefully, we never get to all of the questions, but we'll get to as many of them as we can in the concluding 10 or 15 minutes of our webinar. So if you have questions on Dr. Van Dyke's presentation and what you just heard, please put that in the Q&A. We'll direct them his way. And know also that you'll receive a copy of the slide decks and resources like ACOM's guidelines follow up to this email. It's my honor to introduce our second speaker today, who is Joe McGuire. Joe is the founder and executive director of the National Drug and Alcohol Screening Association, advocating for safe and drug-free workplaces and communities worldwide. She advises and trains professionals overseeing safety-sensitive employees in compliance with Federal Department of Transportation guidelines for safe work screening programs. Joe is a featured speaker on the National Cannabis Initiative Speaker Bureau. And as an accomplished writer and speaker, Joe has traveled extensively to conduct seminars, trainings, conferences, and leadership retreats for the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. Joe was appointed to the Colorado Governor's Task Force and convened to recommend a legislative framework for Amendment 64 in Colorado. And she works closely with national safety experts to educate state and federal policymakers on the importance of public health policies pertaining to workplace drug and alcohol testing. So thank you, Joe, for joining us today. Excited to hear a little bit more about screening and your experience with impairment and screening.
Thank you so much, David. Many of you may suspect that since I'm from the National Drug and Alcohol Screening Association, that I would immediately start arguing with Mike's perspective on drug testing, but I wanted you to really understand that part of the world that I live and breathe in is all about the workplace drug test policy. And Mike said everything absolutely correctly about your analysis and where we are with drug testing. It very much is a presence in system test, which all drug testing is. That's how it was established back there in the 80s when all of these policies were put into place, because not only is that what we had at the time, but that's what we have today. While some of those things are getting more sophisticated, and I'll tell you about a couple of things that are on the horizon. The thing that I could really give to you today as the greatest contribution is review your workplace safety policies pertaining to drug and alcohol testing on a regular basis. Consider them living, breathing documents, and always, always make sure they are compliant with your changing state laws. But not only that, make sure that the tools that you have placed in the policy to help you understand employee impairment or your safety parameters are also included in those policies. So one of the things that we are seeing in our industry is a huge trend, of course, are employers who are moving away from zero tolerance. I really don't like to see them completely moving away from any type of checking to make sure their employees are operating safely or not operating safely. But I do really encourage and want to see stepping back from zero tolerance, because what we do when we do that is we're taking away the ability to assess how to bring someone back to health and wellness, which is so incredibly important. We really need to understand that there are other tools we can use. Mike briefly touched on some of the cognitive measurement tools that are out there. We're seeing some very exciting data. So We're not here to promote any one particular item over another, but we're seeing some great data and some studies on some of these cognitive impairment tests. Like you said, the app-based, it just takes a minute for someone to do this every single day. You get a baseline on that employee. And then if there's any type of impairment, whether that is from fatigue, from stress, from, work, home life balance, whatever that is, or use of substances, then you can put a care plan in place through your EAP program and say, what's going on? What can we do to help you? How can we walk you through this? And if that does pertain to some type of substance abuse, then it's an opportunity to educate on the policies. Maybe it's a substance use issue, so there's some education. If it's a substance abuse issue and we're seeing that someone has developed a problem, needs some help, I am seeing employers literally alter their policies in ways that are very exciting to me to help people have some time, maybe through some FMLA leave, where they can get some assistance, figure out how to get a better work-life balance, get a more healthy way of approaching life. Some companies are actually letting employees use this time to take some courses that will improve their things that are doing in their professions, professional development. And so when they can do this, they actually come back to work with better skills and more attuned to the workplace and able to jump in. And we're seeing some companies that are having some tremendous success with that, and they're really loving that. So as far as the drug test piece goes, there are some things on the horizon that I think are exciting. We have some companies that are trying to develop very recent oral fluid testing that gets really close to testing that parent drug that you see in blood. But blood testing to me is impossible for the workplace because it's too invasive and costly, and all of the other things. It's also not an impairment test. Oral fluid is not an impairment test, but very, very recent use. Like there's some companies that are trying to narrow this down to a window of hours, like 2 to 4 hours. I love that. I think that's very exciting. Is that impairment? No, it's not, because we still don't have an impairment standard. But what we would be able to do then is say, well, if you used within 4 hours and it's noon, well, then perhaps, we've got a problem. Someone might have used during the working hours. That would be cool. We're not quite there yet. So oral fluid is exciting, and I like the thought of it. And it's getting us closer to telling us a story. But again, it's a tool in a toolbox. And I think we have to look at other ways that we can invest our dollars in our people rather than in replacing our people. I know that you all know our human resources are our most valuable resource, but always consider the fact that your drug test is a tool in the toolbox. There are a lot of other things encompassing that. And as far as drug and alcohol testing world is concerned, this really starts with training your supervisors to know your people and to understand if there's some type of unsafe behavior that is outside of that person's, baseline of operations, and how can we pull them aside, find out what's going on, rectify that, and get them back to work safely. I'm always available and happy to answer any questions that you may have surrounding your policies. So if that's something that you need, please let the administrators know. And thanks for letting me share with you a bit today. Happy to take some questions.
Thank you so much, Joe, and really appreciate the context of this is a people issue. We sometimes forget a little bit about that when we talk about impairment and testing and all these measurements. These are people. And also the importance of reviewing workplace policy. We're going to shift gears and talk a little bit more on a broad policy level in just a moment, but reviewing your individual organizational policy around drug-free workplace and where and how cannabis is in that policy is a really important first step. And also talking about making policies be living and breathing documents through education and training, through annual review. So thanks so much, Joe, for touching on those things. And once again, to our participants, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A as those come up. So it's my honor to introduce our third speaker of the day, Andrew Friedman. Andrew is a senior vice president at Forbes Tate and executive director of the Coalition for Cannabis Policy, Education, and Regulation. Andrew was Colorado's first cannabis czar under Governor Hickenlooper from 2013 to 2017, and his firm has since worked directly for several state governments, including California, Florida, Massachusetts, Maine, Rhode Island, and Illinois, and testified to all governments considering legalization. He's been a featured speaker at many conferences, including the Code Conference, Summit, and Aspen Ideas Fest. And Andrew was recognized as one of Fast Company's 100 most creative people in business. Men's Health magazine named him one of the 30 top health influencers of the last 30 years, labeling him, and this is in quotes, legal weed's best friend. He has been featured on 60 Minutes, NBC Nightly News, The Today Show, The New York Times, The Washington Post, The Wall Street Journal, Politico, The Boston Globe, Governing Magazine, and more. And in April of 2022, just last year, Forbes magazine's named Friedman one of the five most influential voices in cannabis policy, on a list that includes Snoop Dogg, Charles Koch, and several U.S. senators and representatives. Andrew holds a JD from Harvard Law School and a BA in philosophy and political science from Tufts University. So thank you, Andrew, for joining us today. We're really grateful to have you as part of our panel.
David, that was, I shouldn't have sent the full bio. I'm really sorry about that. So, but thanks for reading it all. Can we go to my first slide?
Yep.
Perfect. And both, I want to thank Joe and Joe and Mike, who were both instrumental in the rollout of cannabis legalization back in the day. Dr. Van Dyke and I went on the roadshow quite often, and it was really his expertise that guided most of cannabis policy in those opening days when we were really deciding what to do with really critical things like edibles, which we were kind of the first in the nation to deal with those issues. I am the lawyer on this panel, but I'm not your lawyer. I am going to switch gears a little bit to talk about our work over at CPAIR, which is the Coalition for Cannabis Policy, Education, and Regulation, which really is a group dedicated to the idea that cannabis reform is already here, and how at the federal level do we help states get it right? And so taking a few steps back, when we think about workplace safety, how do we handle what really is a quagmire of an issue? And so we've actually written a paper about this that will be sent out afterwards. It was written by Dr. Stacy Gruber and Dr. Kelly Sager, who over at Harvard Medical Center, along with John Hudak, who at the time was at the Brookings Institution and now runs the program over at Maine. Although I should say, John Hudak did not receive $1 for putting that together. And it really explores all the tensions that exist right now with workplace safety as it comes to cannabis. Some of this is mentioned already, but we're really dealing with somewhere between 12 to 20% of your local population that regularly uses cannabis, which is a major part of your workforce, and a hard group just to say, I guess you just can't come work here at all. And really that position ends up to be untenable. And that's in a state with adult use, that's in a state with medical use, or that's a state where it's prohibited. It's very clear that while there might be differences in how much people like cannabis in those states, you're still dealing with 12, 15, 16% people who are regularly using cannabis. And then those states have different levels of allowable use. And then the other tension within that, as we've mentioned before, but worth taking a double beat on, presence does not equal intoxication. And that makes this very hard policy going forward. And finally, that the current testing has, and this isn't something we've talked about much here, but really deserves to be a major part of the conversation. We'll bring it up here. Current testing has inherent equity concerns. The data from this, and it's worth reading the paper on this, the data from this is, even in cause-based and random-based testing, it is often administered in an unequitable manner. In an inequitable manner, you're more likely to catch some people rather than other people in a way that does not line up either with safety or with fairness. And so there's a lot of reasons we should be digging into the policy of of cannabis to create a science and equity-centered framework around this. I'll end on the setting up of the tension here with an example, because there really are safety-sensitive positions here where we do need to tackle this issue and tackle it soon. The hardest example I can think of is you are a trucking company in a state with medical cannabis. The state has employment protections for medical cannabis use, and your trucker was driving through a state where it is prohibited, and there is per se limits, meaning if you are found to have any presence of cannabis in your system, you can be pulled over and given a DUI. If you're pulled over, if one of your employees is pulled over in a state in a safety sensitive position, having found presence of cannabis and gets tested and gets charged with a DUI, what do you do as an employer there? That is a very difficult question. It is one that spans multiple jurisdictions' laws and has a lot of federal overlap as well. But I'm just going to put this out there because I think we tend to think about this as an issue of legalization. This is actually just an issue of cannabis. This issue has existed for since the existence of cannabis, and it's one where thankfully we have some good answers already. There's just more we can do if we take a more responsible approach from the federal level. So if you go to the next slide. We've written out some policy recommendations and avenues for future policy and research, but from a broad framework from a broad change of framework, what we're really talking about here is moving away from a simple prohibition mindset, which is really, I think, where the federal government has been stuck for the last couple of decades, to one that addresses unsafe workplace usage and really tries to tackle the issue head on, again, thinking through issues of safety, of equity. And that's really going to take a mix of science, data, and policy together. And so to way too quickly run through this, there's some places in science that we have to dig deeper into, and I think Joe got to a lot of it. Of that, we need better technology here, ones that more quickly get to issues of intoxication. But one of the first things we also have to do, because it is a complicating factor, is assess understudied factors that impact risk of cannabis-related impairment. Unlike alcohol, where you can kind of take somebody's height, weight, age, and line up how much alcohol is likely to have an impairing effect. That does not really exist with cannabis, and there can be quite a few unknown factors about the individual's genetic profile, along with an exposure of minor cannabinoids and use of other medications that can really lead to intoxication at much smaller levels, and that needs to be investigated. There needs to be much more federal research around that. Two, we need to investigate valid and reliable alternative methods that assess impairment regardless of the source. Joe really got to that, and I do believe that there are some great things on their way, but the time to invest in that is now. Three is that governments and employers should evaluate the weaknesses in the current workplace testing science and invest again heavily in information that both will train everybody for the difficulty of this issue and invest in technology that it better captures current intoxication. And then the next part is that it is time to start collecting the data and disseminate information from employees and employers about this issue. We need to have anonymized data that can capture when we are seeing presence of cannabis, when the presence of cannabis increases, when that is correlated with an increase in safety accidents, to better be able to know how big of a problem we have here. Five is we need to create a clearinghouse of best practices and latest data at the federal level. These are complicated issues, and it's not a one size fits all. But what do you do if you're in a safety sensitive position versus what do you do if you're a mass employer and you employ across multiple states? All of these have answers, and we need a clearinghouse at the federal level. That the U.S. Department of Labor must be a part of that solution and respond to the reality of state level cannabis reform. Again, that it's a department that's really stuck in the era of prohibition that really could be helping us gather the sort of data and science that we need to have responsible policies here. States should promulgate regulations that require employers to report de-identified workplace drug testing punishments. We really should be able to have more data around that that doesn't exist. And finally, unions and others worker rights organizations should elevate issues of fairness and equity related to workplace substance testing. I know that's a lot to throw at you, but I don't want to go over time right now. And I just wanted to say, please, please, please read our paper here that will be sent out later by David that goes deeper into all of these. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew. As our participants are thinking about questions to put in the chat, I have a host of questions that came up while you're talking, but the first one I have, and perhaps I'll start with you, Andrew, because you're on the sort of front line of this conversation nationally. We've been pretty intentional about using the word cannabis. However, part of Mike's presentation, part of state law has used the word marijuana or medical marijuana. There's all sorts of other words and names that people use for this substance. And so can you talk a little bit about, the intentionality behind using cannabis, or how that's come about from your perspective or from the perspective of Forbes Tate, and what the more meaning is? Like what words should people be thinking about here in terms of an equity lens, if you don't mind?
Yeah, we tend to go with cannabis. It's hard because cannabis can mean both the marijuana plant and the hemp plant. And so scientifically, it's a difficult distinction to be made. However, from a policymaking perspective, marijuana has been associated as being tied to kind of the more racist elements of drug policy. Marijuana being a way of linking it to Mexico. And so the general term has moved to cannabis. We also generally talk about adult use rather than recreational use. But again, Colorado passed recreational marijuana as Amendment 64. And so you'll hear a lot of different terms. Generally at the federal level, you'll hear adult cannabis use to refer to intoxicating cannabis forms of cannabis used for people 21 and over.
Got it.
Hey, David, can I just add to that?
Yes, please.
I just want to say, I mean, I definitely try my best to use the word cannabis all the time. And I heard myself use marijuana in that talk, and I want to apologize for using that word. 7 years of policy work at Colorado, being forced to use the word marijuana it's hard to get rid of. And in Colorado, I often call it retail use because that was our decision at one time. We didn't want people to think that this was fun. So that's why we didn't use the word recreational.
Recreational. Thanks, Mike. Yeah, language really does matter, right? And words matter, and they mean different things to different people. So I'm appreciative that we level set there. Someone asked, is it intentional that we held this event on April 20th? Yes, absolutely. This is a day, just like coming up in May with it being Mental Health Month, where people are talking about cannabis. People are using it, they're talking about it. And so we wanted to make sure that we were providing programming around some of the workplace implications around cannabis as well. So yes, that was absolutely intentional. Another question that comes to mind for me, and I know you responded to it in Q&A, but we often have people talk about, well, what people choose to do on their own time and outside of work is up to them, and we know that it impacts us in the workplace. I think the classic sort of conversation around reasonable concern or reasonable suspicion is usually discussed to us around alcohol use, and I would like to revisit reasonable suspicion. And I think, Joe, I'm aiming towards a question for you here a little bit about if someone is showing up in the workplace clearly impaired, whether that be from alcohol use or cannabis use or other substances, oftentimes it becomes it is a reportable situation to HR. It's something that we want to make sure we go through our processes, but it's also a reflection that something's going on with that person. And there may be an opportunity to do some outreach and just check in with them about how they're doing. So I guess the question here is, how do we talk about some of these activities that probably happen, well, certainly with cannabis use, we think, outside of the workplace, but then people are bringing their selves into the workplace impaired or smelling of like certain things. And what is sort of the role of the employer, in that, whether it be outside the workplace, inside, and I don't love the term reasonable suspicion. So if there's any way for you to respond to this sort of haphazard question that I put together, Joe, would appreciate your thoughts there.
Absolutely. And I do see a question in the chat about probable cause. So maybe probable cause or for cause is a little bit better than reasonable suspicion. Although we use that term because the courts have used that term. So some states have ruled on this and others have not. Most are silent. So the at-home use is always kind of the, like, well, I did it at home all the time. What we really found to be the most consistent practice in when it comes to the legal side of this is, did you come to work prepared to work safely, or did you come to work under the influence of a substance? Doesn't matter if you used it at the breakfast table, in the car, in the parking lot, because you don't typically find employees who are actually actively engaged in the substance use at work unless they're like at a very advanced stage of substance use disorder. And those are extreme cases. That's just not what we commonly see. So use of anything prior to clocking in and being under the use of that thing, whatever it may be, or impaired by any other, for any other reason, that's the concern. So ultimately, that's why, Mike and I both stressed the training, training for those cause situations. Training really should entail signs and symptoms of impairment or being under the influence, or inability to operate safely as a whole. And I always say you have to know your people, and in a good solid training course, you will learn how to approach that from a policy point of view, where we don't want to be confrontational, but we also don't want to let someone go out there and work in an unsafe manner. So there's a way to enforce the policy, to keep the emotion out of it, to do it in a caring way, and to say, we just want to make sure that you're okay. Maybe there's a test that's a part of that. And ultimately, does that person need to be reassigned for the day? Do they need to be sent home for the day? What all of this is based on what your policy says. If your policy says they go on leave until you get a better answer and then they come back, they're not paid leave, whatever that situation is. But there are ways to handle this that are effective and positive and from a caring manner. And it all depends on you absolutely have to know your people when they're operating safely, and then be able to assess if they are now not operating safely. To me, that's everything. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you so much, Joe. That does help. And once again, it comes back to, during your presentation, getting to know the people you work with, whether you're in an office-based situation or in a safety-sensitive position. It's making those human connections to be able to decipher when things are going on that seem a little bit out of whack or different from your normal relationship with an individual. There is a question that recently came up in Q&A that gets at where I was going with my next question, which is, we know that substance use disorder is, and treatment for it is part of ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act. And I'm just curious about, if someone, I think I heard you say this, Mike, but I'm not sure I exactly fully understood it. If someone has a state prescribed medical license and is using it to treat a condition, whether that be mental or physical health, it sounds like that is, and I'm not sure maybe if it's Mike or Andrew that can respond to that. That is something that is not necessarily ADA protected per se. The company can still test, it can still terminate based on a positive screening if that's part of the policy. Did I understand that correctly, Mike or Andrew?
Yeah, no, that's correct. In the state of Colorado, there are some states, and Andrew might be able to talk about, that have implemented different policies, but it is not a federally protected condition.
Correct. There are some states that they have ADA-like language around, you have to prove that it actually has been a hazard at work that has affected your work or affected the safety of those around you. You have to prove intoxication at the site, not just that the patient has used. There are some states that have created those sort of protections around medical cannabis users, but certainly not all of them. And I think more confusing than ever is we don't really have universal policies to address it kind of either way on that.
I see. So do companies that have offices in multiple states, are you seeing them creating separate policies for the various states, or are they going for sort of the most stringent or comprehensive policy and applying it to all? I'm just curious there.
I will tell you that this is a giant mess, and large employers have said over and over again, this is untenable from a national position, to not have more federal guidelines on this, because for the exact reason of, if you own a trucking company that goes through multiple states, and a variety of laws are passed against them, how does that play into your own testing for safety there? And some have adopted very strict, but I hear directly from trucking companies, a good percentage of their workforce does use cannabis, and simply saying we're going to have a zero tolerance policy would mean they don't have enough employees to go forward.
Right, and that's what we've heard from some employers in Colorado as well, that they've shifted from a zero tolerance drug screening test as a requirement of employment because they simply no longer fill positions when that was their standard policy. And so they've had to reevaluate how they discuss cannabis use and drug screening and testing, so that, it's more of a conversation with the employee rather than it being a preventative of them ever working at the organization. So it sounds like that's happening on a national level.
When you read the position statements of companies like Amazon, when Amazon came out and said we're pro descheduling, a lot of what they talk about there is essentially, this is the train has left the station at the state level, and we need federal guidance on how to go forward, and we're not going to get that without descheduling, which is why I think large corporations are starting to look at this and saying this is a workplace issue that now needs to be addressed.
Got it. Thanks again for speaking with us today. I want to make sure we have time for you all. Thanks everyone for joining us as well. So as you exit out of today's webinar, you will be prompted to complete a survey and we will have the link available for you as well. That feedback is really important to us as we present information both to our speakers, but also as we move forward with the series and for the rest of 2023 and later. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, May is Mental Health Month, and you're going to see a lot of messaging around mental health. There is a lot of co-occurring disorders that happen between substance use and mental health. So, for individuals that are coming to work, impaired by substances, we want to talk about comprehensively mental health and what the mental health experience looks like for them as well. There could be physical health issues that are coming up, like pain and pain management, that are part of the conversation as well. But our webinar in May, for the last 3 or 4 years, we've always had a webinar in May on specifically the state of workplace mental health. This is our 3rd year in a row where we'll be hosting partners at Mental Health America and other mental health ambassadors and advocates to talk about workplace mental health policies, programs, and how to support employees and their workplace mental health needs for the 2023. And as I mentioned, I want to thank Andrew and Mike. Joe had to leave for another meeting. And Joe, April 20th is a busy day for all of those of you that are in cannabis policy, industry, et cetera. And so we appreciate you taking a little bit of time today to have this safety-specific programming. We'll leave this webinar open a little bit because we want to make sure that as you exit out, you're able to access that feedback survey so that you can get your continuing education credits. I hope everyone remains healthy and safe out there today. And once again, thanks for everyone participating, and thanks, George.